The night billionaire Theo Weston agreed to a blind date, he expected boredom, not a flying wine glass, a cheating scandal, and a woman whose single glare would ruin his peace for the rest of his life. Theo Weston had attended exactly 3 blind dates in his 32 years of existence, and all 3 had been orchestrated by Marcus, his college roommate turned life ruiner, who possessed the romantic sensibilities of a caffeinated matchmaker with a dartboard. This 4th attempt, Marcus promised with the conviction of a man who'd never been wrong in his life, although he had been, would be different. It was not different. The woman sitting across from Theo had introduced herself as Vanessa, though Theo suspected her real name was something far less glamorous, like Susan. She'd spent the last 47 minutes, Theo had counted, discussing her skincare routine, her upcoming trip to Monaco, and her thoughts on which luxury car best complemented a woman's aura. Theo's aura, apparently, screamed Bentley. He drove a Toyota. Well, he owned several luxury vehicles, but the Toyota had better cup holders. Vanessa leaned forward, her perfume aggressive enough to constitute a war crime, and Theo felt his will to live seeping out through his pores. She was beautiful in the way a magazine cover was beautiful, polished, perfect, and utterly unreal. Her laugh sounded manufactured. Her smile had been focus grouped. Even her hair looked like it had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Theo was contemplating faking a medical emergency, nothing serious, perhaps a sudden gluten intolerance, when the restaurant door burst open with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for action movies or unhinged wedding objections. A woman stormed in. Not walked. Not entered. Stormed. She moved like weather, unpredictable, unstoppable, and utterly unconcerned with the structural damage she might cause. Her dark hair whipped behind her as though even it was furious. Her eyes blazed with the kind of righteous anger that made grown men reconsider their life choices. She wore jeans, a simple blouse, and an expression that could have stripped paint off walls. Theo's heart did something unprecedented in his chest. It lurched. Actually lurched, like it had forgotten how to function and was frantically reading the manual mid-crisis. The woman, this glorious, terrifying force of nature, locked eyes on Vanessa, and Theo watched in fascination as his date's face drained of all color, leaving behind something resembling cottage cheese. The furious woman spoke, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Lucy, she said her name was. Lucy Rainey. And Vanessa, it seemed, had been intimately acquainted with Lucy's boyfriend. Very intimately. For 3 months. Theo blinked. Then blinked again. Then had the rather inappropriate thought that he didn't particularly care about the boyfriend situation because he was too busy trying to remember how oxygen worked. Lucy's voice rose and fell like a symphony of justified rage, each word precisely chosen for maximum devastation. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her disappointment was louder than screaming. Her hurt more cutting than insults. Theo found himself leaning forward, utterly captivated, his own date forgotten entirely. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. She grabbed her wine glass, still half full of an overly expensive Bordeaux, and hurled it directly at Lucy's face. Lucy ducked. Theo, still staring at Lucy like a man who'd just discovered religion, did not. The wine hit him full force, glass, liquid, and the remnants of Vanessa's dignity. Cold Bordeaux drenched his hair, his face, his formerly crisp white shirt. The glass bounced off his shoulder and shattered on the floor with a sound that perfectly encapsulated the death of the evening. The restaurant fell silent. Lucy straightened, her eyes widening as she took in the soaked Billionaire now dripping Bordeaux onto imported Italian tile. For exactly 3 seconds, guilt flickered across her face. Lucy apologized, briefly, genuinely, but Theo barely heard her. He was too busy experiencing what he would later describe to Marcus as a full-system cardiac event. She was magnificent. Fierce and raw and so utterly, devastatingly real that everything else in the room seemed to fade into irrelevant background noise. Lucy didn't linger. She turned on her heel and stormed back outside, presumably to continue destroying her cheating boyfriend's will to live, leaving Theo standing in a puddle of wine and his own shattered composure. He stood there, dripping, aware that every person in the restaurant was staring at him. Vanessa had fled through the back exit. The waiter approached cautiously, as one might approach a large, wet, confused animal. Theo's heart was thundering so violently he wondered if he was having a medical emergency after all. His throat had gone completely dry despite being externally soaked. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet, pulling out enough cash to cover the meal, the wine, the broken glass, and probably the therapy the staff would need after witnessing this disaster. As he walked toward the exit, his shoes squelching embarrassingly, Theo stopped at the host's stand. He asked to speak to the manager. When the nervous man appeared, Theo made a single request: he needed the security footage from tonight. All of it. Particularly the footage that showed the woman who'd just stormed through. The manager stammered something about privacy policies. Theo named a figure that made privacy policies suddenly seem very flexible. As he stepped out into the cool night air, still dripping, still trembling, still feeling like he'd been struck by lightning disguised as a person, Theo Weston made himself a promise. He was going to find her. He was going to find Lucy Rainey if it took every resource, every connection, every ounce of determination he possessed. Because for the first time in his carefully controlled, meticulously organized life, Theo Weston had felt something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He'd felt alive. Theo's obsession, because that's what it was, really, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise around day 3, began with the security footage and evolved into what Marcus diplomatically called intensive research and what Theo's assistant called a concerning fixation requiring professional intervention. He'd watched the footage 47 times. He'd counted. On viewing number 48, his assistant had physically removed his laptop and suggested a spa day. Theo had fired him. Then rehired him an hour later with a raise, because good assistants who staged interventions were hard to find. Through a combination of detective work that would have made private investigators weep with professional jealousy, plus several strategically placed inquiries among his vast network of connections, Theo discovered that Lucy Rainey worked at Print Perfect, a small print shop nestled between a failing bookstore and an aggressively optimistic bubble tea cafe. He'd stood outside for 20 minutes on his first visit, which was 17 minutes longer than any reasonable person would stand outside a print shop, trying to convince his racing heart to behave like an adult organ instead of a caffeinated hamster. When he finally entered, a small bell chimed cheerfully above his head, announcing his presence like a tiny metal trader. Lucy stood behind the counter, her attention fixed on a complicated-looking printer that was making sounds no machine should make while remaining technically functional. She wore her hair pulled back today, and Theo's brain unhelpfully noted that she had a small scar above her left eyebrow that somehow made her more beautiful, which seemed biologically impossible, but there it was. She looked up. Their eyes met. Theo forgot every word in the English language, plus several in French. Lucy's expression shifted from neutral customer service to dawning recognition to something that looked suspiciously like "Are you kidding me right now?" Lucy spoke first, her voice carrying that same sharp edge that had haunted Theo's dreams for the past week. She asked if he was here to file a complaint about the wine incident, her tone suggesting she'd rather fight him than apologize again. Theo, his throat suddenly drier than the Sahara despite consuming 3 bottles of water on the drive over, managed to croak out that no, he wasn't here for that. He needed printing services. Very urgent printing services. Extremely time-sensitive documents that absolutely needed to be printed right now. Lucy stared at him. Then asked what documents. Theo panicked and said business cards. Lucy pointed out that he was literally holding a wallet full of business cards. She could see them. Right there. In his hand. Theo looked down at his wallet, the trader, and his business cards, the double traders, and said he needed different ones. Better ones. These ones were old. From last week. Practically ancient. Lucy's eyebrow rose in an expression of such magnificent skepticism that Theo felt it in his spine. But she took his order. Wrote down specifications in handwriting that was surprisingly neat for someone who looked like she wanted to murder him with the stapler. Told him to come back in 3 days. Theo came back the next morning. He needed scanning services, he explained. Very important documents. Lucy asked what documents. Theo held up a grocery receipt. Lucy stared at the receipt. Then at him. Then back at the receipt. Then she scanned it without saying a word, charged him $15, and returned to her work with the kind of pointed ignorance usually reserved for annoying street performers. Theo came back that afternoon. He needed binding services. What was he binding? Lucy asked without looking up. His thoughts, Theo said before his brain could stop his mouth. His thoughts needed binding. They were very disorganized. Lucy finally looked at him, her expression suggesting she was seriously considering calling security, or possibly an exorcist. Over the next 2 weeks, Theo became as much a fixture at Print Perfect as the temperamental copier and the dying ficus in the corner. He needed laminating. He needed printing. He needed spiral binding, thermal binding, and a type of binding he was reasonably sure he'd invented on the spot. The staff began placing bets. Miguel, who handled the commercial orders, insisted Theo was conducting industrial espionage. Sarah, the graphic designer, argued he was clearly in witness protection and terrible at it. James, the part-timer, maintained that Theo was either deeply in love or having an extended mental breakdown, possibly both. Lucy treated Theo with the patience one might show in persistent fly, annoying but not quite worth the effort of active removal. She rolled her eyes so frequently in his presence that Theo worried she'd strained something. Her sarcasm could strip wallpaper. Her dismissiveness was an art form. And Theo fell deeper every single day. He loved how she muttered under her breath when the printer jammed. He loved how she tied her hair up with whatever was nearby, pens, rubber bands, once a length of ribbon that made his chest ache. He loved how she refused to pretend to like people she didn't, how she rolled her eyes at pretension, how she called out nonsense with the casual confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about being polite somewhere around her second betrayal. She was real in a way Theo had forgotten people could be. After his 14th visit in as many days, he'd needed advice on paper weights. Apparently, Lucy finally stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. Really looked at him, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to solve a complicated equation. Lucy told him, her voice gentler than before but still firm, that he seemed nice enough. But she wasn't interested. She'd just gotten out of a relationship. She wasn't looking for anything. And honestly, she'd seen the woman he'd been with that night, beautiful, polished, perfect. Lucy gestured at herself, at her jeans and her print-stained fingers and her complete lack of design or anything, and said she wasn't that. She couldn't be that. Didn't want to be that. So he should probably stop coming in for fake printing emergencies. Theo left without arguing, his heart sitting somewhere around his shoes. That evening, he sat in Marcus's living room, slumped on the couch like a Victorian maiden with consumption. Marcus listened to the whole pathetic story while eating Chinese takeout directly from the container. When Theo finished, Marcus said something that would change everything. He told Theo that if he loved her, really loved her, he shouldn't give up. That sometimes the right person needed time to see what was right in front of them. Theo sat up straighter. Marcus, interpreting this as encouragement, added that Theo should probably stop lying about needing printing services though, because that was genuinely weird. But Theo barely heard him. Because Theo had just realized something terrifying and wonderful and completely inevitable. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Theo's new strategy involved significantly less printer-related fraud and significantly more genuine human behavior, which was either progress or a sign he'd finally lost his mind entirely. The betting pool at Print Perfect had grown to include 2 regular customers and the bubble tea shop owner next door. He brought coffee. Not expensive coffee that screamed I'm compensating for something, but regular coffee from the cafe down the street where Lucy apparently got hers every morning. He'd learned this through observation, not stalking. There was a difference, he told himself, though the line was admittedly blurry. Lucy accepted the coffee with suspicion, examining it like it might contain truth serum. She thanked him curtly, and Theo left before he could say something idiotic, which he considered a personal victory. He started leaving notes. Small ones. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. The ficus in the corner looked thirsty. The printer on the left was making concerning noises again. Someone had left a very interesting coffee ring on the counter that looked exactly like Abraham Lincoln. Lucy never acknowledged the notes, but she did water the ficus. Theo tried jokes. This went poorly. Why don't scientists trust atoms? He asked one afternoon, his palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Lucy stared at him. Because they make up everything, Theo finished, his voice cracking slightly on the word everything. The silence that followed was profound. Miguel actually left the room. Sarah developed a sudden fascination with the ceiling tiles. Lucy blinked at him with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment, then returned to her work without a word. Theo wanted to sink through the floor and keep going until he reached the Earth's core. But he came back the next day anyway. He helped carry heavy paper shipments when the delivery came. He fixed the temperamental printer using a YouTube video and prayer. He brought pastries for the whole staff, not just Lucy, which earned him Miguel's eternal loyalty and Sarah's cautious approval. Slowly, incrementally, Lucy's irritation began developing hairline cracks. She smiled once, quickly, involuntarily, when Theo tripped over absolutely nothing and caught himself with the grace of a startled giraffe. She asked him to hand her the stapler instead of getting it herself. She made a joke about his persistent printer emergencies, and the fact that she was joking at all felt like winning the lottery. Still, when Theo gathered his courage, what little remained after weeks of gentle rejection, and asked if she'd like to have dinner sometime, Lucy refused. Kindly, but firmly. She told him he seemed sweet. That she appreciated his persistence even if it was slightly unhinged. But she'd seen too many men who seemed one way and turned out to be another. The night they'd met, he'd been with someone like Vanessa. Which meant he liked that type. Which meant Lucy, fundamentally, wasn't his type. How could she trust that he wasn't just bored? Just passing time? Just playing at something because it was new and different? Theo wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that he'd been set up that night, that he'd felt nothing but crushing boredom until Lucy had walked in like a hurricane with a purpose. But Lucy's eyes held old hurt, deep hurt, the kind that didn't heal just because someone insisted it should. So Theo nodded. Thanked her for her honesty. And left. But he didn't stop coming to the shop. 3 weeks after what Theo had started thinking of as the dinner rejection, he was leaving Print Perfect just after 7 in the evening. Lucy had worked late, finishing a rush order for a difficult client. Theo had stayed too, pretending to review documents that definitely didn't need reviewing in a print shop, just to make sure she wasn't alone in the building after dark. Creepy or caring? The line remained blurry. Lucy left a few minutes after he did, waving goodbye with an expression that might have been almost fond, though Theo was afraid to examine it too closely in case he'd imagined it. He was walking to his car when he heard the horn. Loud. Aggressive. Wrong. Theo's head snapped up just in time to see a car racing down the street, too fast, way too fast, and Lucy stepping off the curb, looking at her phone, completely unaware. Everything slowed down in the way it does in moments that divide life into before and after. Theo didn't think. Thinking would have taken too long, would have involved risk assessment and self-preservation and all the things that suddenly didn't matter even a little bit. He ran. His legs moved before his brain issued commands. The distance between them felt infinite and microscopic at once. Lucy looked up at the last second, her eyes widening, and Theo crashed into her with all the grace of a charging rhinoceros with commitment issues. He felt Lucy's body against his as he pushed her out of the path. Felt the impact as they hit the sidewalk together, his arms wrapped around her, trying to take the brunt of their fall. And then he felt nothing but blinding, spectacular pain as the car's side mirror caught his shoulder and hip, spinning him partially, sending him tumbling across the concrete like a badly thrown rag doll. The world tilted sideways. Someone was screaming. Lucy was screaming. His name. She was screaming his name, her voice raw with terror, and some distant part of Theo's brain that wasn't currently processing agony thought that hearing his name in her mouth was worth every broken bone he might have just acquired. Hands on his face. Lucy's hands. Shaking. She was shaking, or he was shaking, or possibly the entire world was shaking. Her voice kept breaking, asking if he was okay, telling him not to move, calling for help, and Theo wanted to tell her he was fine, completely fine, never better actually, but his mouth wasn't cooperating with his intentions. He managed to focus on her face. Her beautiful, terrified face. Tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hair falling forward, creating a curtain around them. Theo smiled. Couldn't help it. She was here. She was safe. Everything else was negotiable. Lucy called him an idiot. Then called him an idiot again, her voice hitching on the word. Asked him what he was thinking, running into traffic like that, he could have died, he could have been killed, what was wrong with him? Theo, his vision starting to blur at the edges in a way that seemed medically concerning, whispered that he hadn't been thinking. That there hadn't been time for thinking. That the only thing that mattered was getting to her before the car did. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Lucy's tears fell onto his face like rain, and Theo lifted one hand, the arm that still worked, to touch her cheek. To prove she was real and safe and here. His vision was definitely getting blurry now. Consciousness was becoming more of a suggestion than a requirement. But before everything faded to soft gray, Theo whispered her name. Just her name. Lucy. Like it was the only word that mattered. Like it was the breath he needed to stay alive. The hospital was too bright, too white, too full of sounds that made Lucy's chest hurt in ways that had nothing to do with her own minor scrapes. She sat in the waiting room chair, hands still shaking despite her best efforts to steady them. Nobody had ever done something like that for her. Nobody had ever looked at her the way he had in that split second before impact, not with fear, but with absolute certainty. Like saving her wasn't a choice but an inevitability. Lucy had built walls. High walls with security systems and moats. She'd needed those walls after her ex, after the betrayal. But Theo had taken a car to the shoulder for her. Which seemed like it should count for something. A doctor finally emerged, looking tired but not grave. Theo was stable. Bruised extensively. Possible concussion. But lucky, all things considered. Could she see him? Lucy heard herself ask, her voice barely recognizing itself. Room 347. Theo lay in the hospital bed looking absolutely terrible and somehow still managing to make her heart perform complicated gymnastics. Bruises bloomed across visible skin like violent watercolors. Bandages wrapped his shoulder. His usually perfect hair stuck up at odd angles, making him look younger, vulnerable, human in a way that made Lucy's chest physically ache. Theo's eyes opened. Just barely, heavy with medication and exhaustion, but they found her immediately. And he smiled. Actually smiled, this soft, wondering expression that belonged in poetry or anywhere except a hospital room where he was lying broken because of her. Lucy's carefully constructed composure crumbled like a sand castle in a hurricane. She'd been so wrong. Theo wasn't playing games. Wasn't passing time. He'd meant every ridiculous coffee, every terrible joke, every quiet moment of just existing in her presence. He'd been there, really there, the whole time, and she'd been too scared to see it. Theo whispered her name, his voice rough with medication and emotion, and Lucy felt something inside her chest that she thought permanently broken suddenly remember how to work. Over the next 2 days, Lucy learned several things. Hospital chairs were designed by sadists. Theo talked in his sleep, occasionally her name surfacing like something precious being brought up from deep water. And she was completely, irrevocably in love with him. When Theo was finally lucid, he looked at her sitting beside his bed, joy and fear mixed together. Lucy took his hand and told him she'd been an idiot. That she'd been so focused on protecting herself that she almost missed him. She told him that when he'd run toward her instead of away from danger, he'd shown her exactly who he was. Not with words or promises, but with pure, undeniable action. Theo's eyes were getting shiny. She told him, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, that she'd fallen for him too. That she didn't want him to stop showing up, stop bringing terrible coffee, stop making jokes that physically wounded everyone in hearing range. That she wanted him to stay. A nurse bustled in, checked Theo's vitals, and asked if his wife needed anything, coffee, perhaps? Lucy turned approximately the color of a tomato having an identity crisis. Theo looked like he'd just been handed the secrets of the universe wrapped in a bow. The nurse left, completely unaware of the emotional apocalypse she just triggered. Lucy started to stammer a correction, but Theo's fingers tightened around hers. She stopped talking. Theo was looking at her with an expression that made her forget her own name. His thumb traced a slow line across her knuckles, and Lucy felt that simple touch everywhere. When Theo spoke, his voice was low, rough with emotion and medication and something that sounded like hope wrapped in terror. He told her he loved her. Had loved her since the night she'd stormed into that restaurant like righteous fury incarnate. That he'd been completely certain she was going to ruin his peace for the rest of his life, and he'd been absolutely right, and he'd never been more grateful for anything. Lucy's vision was getting concerningly blurry. Theo told her that lying in that hospital bed, the only thing that anchored him was the thought of her. That he'd face down 1,000 cars if it meant keeping her safe. Had to ask her. Theo's voice dropped even lower, became something sacred. He asked her to marry him. Not someday. Not eventually. Now. Lucy's whole face trembled. Her heart was doing something unprecedented in her chest. Tears spilled over, happy tears, shocked tears, overwhelmed tears that came from someplace deep and previously unexplored. She whispered yes. Not dramatic. Not loud. But certain. So absolutely certain that it surprised her. Yes, she'd marry him. Yes, she loved him. Yes to everything, all of it, as long as he promised to stop getting hit by cars because her heart genuinely couldn't take another incident like this. Theo smiled. Really smiled, the kind of smile that made all his bruises irrelevant. His eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out, but his hand stayed wrapped around hers like an anchor. Lucy sat there, her hand in his, and traced her thumb across his knuckles. Over the small scars and the 4 bruise and the evidence of a life she was now part of. And she realized something that made her own tears fall faster. She hadn't just accepted a proposal. She'd accepted the man who'd loved her before she'd thought to love him back. Who'd seen her at her worst, furious, betrayed, throwing wine-inspired chaos into strangers' lives, and decided that was exactly who he wanted. Who'd waited patiently while she built walls, never demanding she tear them down, just persistently proving he was worth opening the door for. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and amber. Lucy leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently against their joined hands. And smiled. Because sometimes the best love stories started with flying wine and ended with ridiculous hospital proposals. Sometimes the right person was the one who ran toward you when everyone else ran away. Sometimes forever began the moment you finally stopped fighting it. And Lucy Rainey, for the first time in longer than she could remember, stopped fighting. She had come home.